cute little boy.
I'm afraid that's a child who's been injured in the
Oh,
Gaza Strip, who is now waiting medical attention at
oh,
a hospital, and where they don't have beds or facilities to take the right kind of care. So as you can see, I'm going to guide us through a conversation today about the humanitarian nightmare that is unfolding right now in Israeli Palestine, in particular in the aftermath of Hamas's brutal attack on the Israeli and then kibbutzes, musical festivals, civilians, soldiers, intelligence facilities a week ago. And the likely ongoing escalation of the response by Israel as it moves to try to dismantle Hamas in the West Bank. And so I'm going to say a couple things at the outset, and I don't like dwelling on these images, but on the other hand, I don't think we can put our heads in the sand about the level of violence and the degree to which civilians, women, children, the elderly are being killed, traumatized, injured, abducted in this conflict. And so that is what these images are reflecting. And I want to say two things at the outset in terms of my perspective, and the first concerns the idea that I'm less interested in who is to blame at the current moment for what's just happened or what is about to happen. And so in saying that, I think clearly Hamas needs to be condemned for barbaric, inhumane, grotesque attacks on the Israelis. And clearly their effort is to, on the one hand, incite an Israeli response, and on the other hand, increase their stature within the overall conflict and struggle for power between Hamas and the Palestinian Authority within the occupied territories. So my deeper question is not, do we blame Hamas? Clearly, we blame Hamas, but is Hamas starting this conflict? And I want to say only in the proximate sense. And in the deeper sense, there's blame enough to go around, and I will try to indicate some of the more long-term causes. And part of the question is, in what circumstances are you able to radicalize? And it appears that there are thousands or tens of thousands of relatively young Palestinian men who invaded Israel a week ago and who took innocent lives and abducted innocent people. What are the conditions that lead people to be able to do that? And there I think we have to ask longer term questions, questions that take us back not days or weeks but decades. And there is blame enough to go around. But having said that, I think the right question isn't really about who is originally responsible. I think that the most important question is there any way out? And out of what I'm going to refer to as a cycle of crime, revenge, and further vengeance. And so clearly, what Hamas did last weekend and continued to do over several days was criminal, right? And in uh, perfect world, there would be institutions that would apprehend and try them for their criminality. But that's not the world we live in. The world we live in, the response is from the victim, right? In this case, Israel. And they are going to administer what they see to be the appropriate punishment for this crime. And clearly, in the moment in which you are attacked, it's very difficult to be impartial, to have a sense of proportionality or justice. And I think we can anticipate that the response will not be proportionate to the crime, that it will be therefore perceived on the part of those who are punished or who are caught up in the crossfire as Israel tries to avenge the Hamas attack, that they will perceive themselves not as being punished for a crime, but as victims of a crime, and therefore will seek vengeance themselves. And then we start a cycle that has an escalatory logic to it. And that's frankly where we are right now, already in the middle of such a cycle. And that's why I say looking backwards and trying to decide where the cycle started becomes irrelevant at some point. What becomes more important is trying to figure out if there's any way to break the cycle. And so that's my vantage for today. I know that this is a topic that prompts deep and passionate disagreement, that it's particularly hard to discuss since it is so fresh and actually unfolding in real time in front of our eyes, since we live in a world of social media, and the footage in particular on the left is screen captures from social media protests in which we see in real time slaughter, barbarism, and that makes our emotions all the more raw and difficult to contain or contend with. And I just want to say I am open to hearing your ideas and your thoughts, including your passionate disagreement with me. I have a vantage. I know it's not the only vantage on this. I want to, in the middle of all of this, call your attention to a quotation from Alexis de Tocqueville. And I didn't actually put it on the board. I think I'm doing it correctly from memory. I will point out to you that Tocqueville, in the aftermath of the French Revolution of 1848, became part of a new revolutionary post-monarchical government. And he, among other things, as the member of government, launched a colonial campaign in Algeria. And he had hopes that this would be a settler form of colonialism, and that the French and the Algerians would learn to live peaceably side by side, and that actually both peoples would benefit. And to his credit, Tocqueville visited several times, and over the course of visiting, came to recognize that this was not possible. The idea that the Algerians would welcome the French, that the French would respect the Algerians, that they would come to enrich each other culturally as well as materially, was the kind of thing a philosopher dreams about, but not the kind of thing a military occupation can actually produce. And so there's a phrase in a report that Tocqueville wrote later as he was reconsidering the justice and appropriateness of the French occupation of Algiers. And he said, quote, I believe I have it right, we have barbarized a not uncivilized people. And what I want to point out is that Hamas barbarized Israel. Israel is getting prepared to further barbarize the Palestinians in the Gaza Strip. That people are not barbarians, are not capable of barbaric, brutal violence for the most part, just because that's the way we are, or that's the way, as we more often say, they are. They're not fully human, they're human animals, as the Israeli Minister of Defense said the other day. I don't believe that. I believe we are equipped with empathy and the capacity for justice, and that in the right circumstances, those moral capacities are regulative for human beings. We become barbaric when we have been barbarized, and these conditions barbarize both sides. And so that creates the moral humanitarian imperative to figure out how we can break this cycle and prevent the escalation of barbarity in this region. So very quickly, the factual background, and I think my data is a little bit stale at this point. I prepared this slide yesterday. I believe there may be as many as 1,500 Israeli dead right now. One way that this is expressed is that this is the most Jews who've been killed in a single event since the Holocaust. I'm not positive that's historically accurate, but I'll show you data in a moment. I think the previous high year for Israeli civilian casualties in the last 15 years was 88, according to the UN. And so we've got a complete multiple order of difference in terms of the number of Israeli casualties. We're approaching 2,000 Palestinians dead in Gaza from Israeli counterattacks, in addition to probably at least 1,500 Hamas soldiers dead in Israel from the Israeli effort to repel the incursion. And we have, I believe it's at least 150 Israelis abducted and held captive in who knows where in Gaza, right? And these are the elderly, children's. Apparently, there might be an infant, a 9-month-old who was taken hostage, teenagers who were at a music festival. These are clearly innocent civilians who are now being held. And I want to be as clear as possible, right? Hamas says that each time there's an unannounced Israeli strike on the Gaza, they will publicly behead a captive, right? And so this is the ongoing escalation of terroristic tactics, in a sense, trying to use the techniques introduced by ISIS in Afghanistan and Iraq and Syria. And at the same time, and I think this is critical to appreciate, this is part of Hamas's chief objective in the incursion into Israel, is to take Israeli captives, because this is the gold standard of terrorist success. They believe that this will increase their prestige among Palestinians and increase their likelihood of continuing to be able to struggle against the Palestinian Authority for the mantle of leadership, for the capacity to, in particular, protect Palestinians against Israeli aggression. That's the lens through which they see it. And I think it's important to at least acknowledge that they see the Israeli captives as a way, and I'll get into this in a few minutes, but of preventing ongoing settler aggression in the West Bank, ongoing Israeli military aggression and dispossession of Palestinians in occupied but ultimately Palestinian territory. So next thing, just in terms of getting the facts on the ground, this was a very sophisticated attack. It appears that they used drones to disable key components of the infrastructure of the so-called Iron Dome, the Israeli anti-missile system, that they were able to penetrate Israeli intelligence and military facilities on the border with Gaza after having broken through the border wall, and then they were able to take down, in particular, very quickly, the intelligence and communication systems. And as a result, therefore, the Israeli military was in the dark about exactly what was happening or how to respond. In addition to that, the Israeli military clearly did not anticipate that this size or sophistication of attack would be occurring, and their forces were mainly in the West Bank and slow to relocate to where the action was. So let's turn now for a moment to the Israeli response. And as we know, there's been fighting to repel the Hamas insurgents, and that appears to now have been mainly completed and successful. And there is now evacuation order for the north of the Gaza Strip. To just for a moment remember the scale of what we're talking about here. And I will share some other maps with you in a moment. But Israel as a whole is about the size of the state of New Jersey. There are about 9.5 million citizens. About 7.5 million of them are Jewish. About 2 million of them are Arab or Palestinian. Um, the Gaza Strip is about the size of Manhattan, a little bigger than Manhattan, and there are almost 2 million Palestinian residents of the Gaza Strip. And so we're talking about densely populated, relatively small areas. And this is a cheek by jowl situation. The Palestinians and the Israelis, including Arab Israelis, live side by side in very close proximity. So the Israelis have formed recently, just the last few days, a unity government. As you're probably aware, the Israeli governmental system is a parliamentary system with proportional representation. The Knesset, therefore, has multiple parties, and they typically form coalition governments. There is in place until just a few days ago a very right wing, arguably the most extreme government in Israeli history, led, of course, by Benjamin Bibi Netanyahu. And in light of this attack, all of the parties have come together and formed a unity government, and they have asserted that they are going to destroy or dismantle Hamas. And I want to um, speak to the logic of that response for a moment, and then also indicate why it presents a dilemma for Israel to embrace that aim. So I think there are two central reasons why destroying Hamas seems to be the consensus position of Israeli politicians and many Israeli civilians. The first is the need to reassert the ineradicability of Israel, that Israel is going to remain a country in its current location that functions as an Israeli democracy, and we'll problematize that concept in a moment. It's maybe a contradiction in terms, but for now, the key idea that this is not an impermanent colonial imposition of Britain in 1948 and the Jews that ultimately will be reversed, which has been the stated policy of Hamas and Iran, and at different points, many other countries in the region. But increasingly, it appears, right, under the Abraham Accords negotiated by the Trump administration, under the Biden administration's efforts to negotiate mutual recognition between Saudi Arabia and Israel, that more and more countries in the Middle East, more Arab Muslim countries, as well as non-Arab Muslim countries, maybe, are accepting the permanent, ineradicable existence of Israel in its current location in the Middle East, and that what the Hamas attack does is call that into question. Maybe the Israeli military is not as formidable. Maybe the military defense systems put in place, the intelligence operations, which have given Israel a aura of impregnability, of almost invulnerability. They're always one step ahead, always more powerful than whoever wants to attack them. Maybe that's not true in 2023 anymore. Maybe, therefore, the other regimes of the region should recalibrate and re-embrace the objective of not making peace with and coming to coexist with Israel, but instead of eliminating Israel. The former Israeli prime minister once expressed the idea that Israel is a villa in the jungle, that it is surrounded by countries that want to eradicate it if they can, to wipe it from the map. And so there's a need to say, if you think we're going anywhere, we are going to make it clear to you that you will pay a cost that will cause you to reconsider that proposition. The second reason I think there's widespread consensus in Israel about the need to take out Hamas is that, in a sense, the very raison d'etre of Israel, the reason it exists in the aftermath of the Holocaust, is to provide a state that does not permit the slaughter of Jews, right? And if this is the largest destruction of Jewish civilians since the Holocaust, it requires for the state to maintain its legitimacy, its reason for existence, that there be a response in kind, that it take down the organization that is responsible for the slaughter. Having said all of that, I think cool-headed Israelis and observers around the world, including people like Benjamin Netanyahu, who comes from a military background, and the military leaders of Israel, recognize that Hamas probably cannot be eliminated, that probably its leadership is out of the country already or in deep and sophisticated bunkers, and that reoccupation of the Gaza is what would be required. And of course, in 2005, Israel came to the conclusion that that was untenable, and there's no reason to believe that that has changed, that Hamas is, in a sense, luring Israel into invading and occupying because it thinks it's to its advantage, that it takes attention away from its miserable failure as a governing organization and puts it on the enemy, which creates much greater unity. The most recent poll that's been done shows that Palestinians in the Gaza, there are only about 30% who support Hamas. The Israeli invasion, should it occur, the ground invasion, would certainly produce much greater unity among Palestinians, just as the Hamas incursion has produced much greater unity among Israelis. But in addition to those political calculations, there are the military calculations. It is very, very difficult to occupy long-term a territory the residents of whom do not want you there, right? And so how do the Israelis go in, take out Hamas, leave, and prevent Hamas from simply coming back? I don't think there's a viable scenario for accomplishing that. And so these considerations are causing the government to struggle to figure out how to respond. This is a dilemma. For now, what they are doing is launching sustained air assaults on the Hamas infrastructure in Gaza. And this has led to hundreds of thousands or millions of people evacuating. We'll say more about this. The United Nations is calling this a devastating humanitarian crisis. And again, I think we have to recognize that this is mutual barbarization, that what Hamas did to Israeli civilians is the most brutal kind of crime against humanity imaginable. What Israelis are doing, what the state is doing to the residents of Gaza is, I don't want to engage in trying to quantify the unquantifiable. I don't want to say it's equally brutal. I just want to say it is similarly brutalizing. There's a Palestinian man who was interviewed by the New York Times who was talking about the fact that his son is a young aspiring musician. He says his son has a musician's soul and temperament. He asks the question, if the Israelis have to bomb us, can they make their bombs smaller and quieter? And he said, look, I want a future in which my son can become a musician. I fear the future in which he becomes a terrorist because of what is happening to him. His son and his other two children and his wife and he were on the border with Egypt. They had been permitted by Egypt to leave, not the father, but the children and the wife. And at the moment they were preparing to depart, the Israelis bombed the bridge and road via which they would depart. They were deeply traumatized, especially the children, by this. And this is what he worries, that it's going to radicalize his son. That's just right one perspective. I was listening to another interview of a woman whose son was attending the music concert, who she knows lost his arm in the fighting, but nevertheless was taken as a captive, right? And so you've got a mother and a father talking about the impact of this battle on their civilian children. It is mutually barbarizing. Um, I know that my diagram here is way out of date, right? So this is from 6 days ago now, and the number of Israeli deaths is now up over 1,500. The number of Palestinian deaths up over 2,000. I use this diagram nevertheless to provide a little bit of context. Please note that the number of Israeli deaths will be so many more than there have been in any point over the last 15 years, that very quickly the number of Palestinian deaths will be higher than any recent conflict as well. These are the places that were attacked either in the box by militants or with the circles via missiles in the immediate vicinity of the Gaza Strip. This is just a little bit more geographic context, right? And the idea that Israel, this really quite tiny state, is hemmed in on all sides by societies who at various points have declared open hostility and actually attacked Israel. It's worthwhile remembering that in the 1967 war, Israel ultimately claimed control of Gaza, the West Bank, and the Golan Heights. And so this is the BBC's map. Part of the reason they're a different color is because these are, quote, occupied territories under international law. They are not part of Israel, but they are not returned to the sovereign states that they belonged to prior to the war. And this is the longest occupation in post-war history, right? And so that's just a little bit of sense. Remember, tiny country and people living side by side, separated very often by mere yards from people who they mutually dehumanize and fear. Um, this then is the military zone that Israel has declared a closed zone in order to repel all of the Hamas fighters. And this is the area in the Gaza Strip north of the Wadi Gaza line that Israelis have told the Palestinians and Hamas must be evacuated, right? There are over 1.1 million people, including in Gaza City and Jabalia, the two of the most populous areas in the Gaza Strip, who are now under evacuation orders from Israel. And what they're saying is we're getting ready to bomb and probably invade those areas. If you're a civilian and you don't want to be in harm's way, get out. But please note how difficult it is to evacuate over 1 million people from a densely populated, desperately poor area. Roughly 50% of the inhabitants of Gaza are unemployed and officially in a very ungenerous poverty line, living in poverty. So it's a very difficult thing that the Israelis are demanding that the Palestinians do in Gaza. Um, this is a little bit of an indication of the strategy that Israel has taken so far, which has been primarily to respond via airstrikes, but the airstrikes are necessarily in densely populated areas because this is where Hamas has located its infrastructure, its facilities. And as you can see, you're targeting, right, the Hamas facility, but you take out 10 or 20 or a whole block of civilian homes and apartments in the region. This is the daily casualty rate. And as you can see, it keeps going up again. This is not fully up to date. I'm going to start now trying to provide a little bit of broader context, and this is still the most immediate context, and so among the questions, why did Hamas attack now? Why was Israel caught so flat-footed by the attack? And so I think that the first thing to recognize, right, is that Israel is led by Benjamin Netanyahu, who has assembled a coalition that includes some of the most extreme right-wing parties like the Israeli Power Party, and we will see parties that call for a second Nakba. That's the Arabic word for catastrophe, which is how Palestinians and many Arabs and Muslims view what happened in 1948, right? That the Israeli the founding of the Israeli state and the fleeing of Palestinians from their previous homeland. That's the Nakba. Members of the coalition government are calling for a second Nakba, meaning, and again, just to go to the map for a moment, getting the Palestinians out of the West Bank, maybe getting them out of Gaza and the Golan Heights. So this is I believe it's accurate to call it a religious fundamentalist argument. According to the Hebrew Bible, Israel is territory for the Jews. So one argument that's being made is that that means it should be exclusively Jewish. And so the settler movement is moving into the West Bank and trying explicitly to dispossess the Palestinians so that they leave and go elsewhere. And there are now members of the Israeli government who support this and who are supporting the prime minister on the condition that he legitimize their position. And so the thing that I think most of us have been paying attention to in Israeli politics over the last 6 months is judicial reform, in particular, the effort to scale back what kind of legislation the judiciary can review and ultimately invalidate. And so a law has been passed by the Knesset by a very narrow governing majority and with very strong opposition, not just from the parties not in the government, but from large parts of Israeli society. The Chief Justice of the Israeli Supreme Court, Esther Hayut, calls the reform, quote, a fatal blow to democracy. And roughly half of the Israeli population strongly opposes these now enacted reforms. They are, of course, being challenged in front of the very Supreme Court, who the legislation attempts to scale back. I think this is almost the definition of a constitutional crisis, in the sense that the ruling coalition has said even if the Supreme Court declares this legislation invalid, they will not abide by the decision of the Supreme Court. But in terms of the immediate context, part of what has been happening in Israel is sustained demonstrations, including civil disobedience, where members of the military reserve, 300,000 of whom have just been called up, have not been going to their required training on a monthly basis to express their rejection of this policy. So this government, right, which is called about these reforms and to be as clear as possible, wants these reforms in part to keep the judiciary from holding settlers and the military and the government accountable when they engage in ongoing dispossession of Palestinians. This government has allowed new settlements to continue in occupied territory, despite the fact that the United Nations, the United States, Israel's closest ally, are all clear that this is illegal, and there's broad-based condemnation of it. The head of the Ministry of National Security is a member of the party that is most actively promoting this. There's increased talks of annexation of the West Bank. Again, without getting too far into the technical details, there are 3 administrative units in the West Bank, A, B, and C. C is basically controlled by the Israeli military, and most of this is occurring in Area C. And the result is essentially a series of provocations. One Israeli human rights activist calls them pogroms by Israeli settlers who accuse Palestinians of things like stealing their sheep, and then go with machine guns and torches and attempt to uh, intimidate and burn out the Palestinian neighbors, many of whom have lived in the same community for generations. And so the military is very much preoccupied in the West Bank. It's trying to prevent these settlers from fomenting a civil war in the West Bank, and trying to protect them at the same time. We have a society that is very internally divided, and this is, I think, part of the opportunity, if you will, that Hamas saw. I want you to have a sense of what is happening here, and so this is a diagram of the growth of Israeli settlements in the West Bank. It only goes up to 2018, but as you can see, there are now hundreds of thousands of them. This is the extent of the settler population. Again, we're talking now about hundreds of thousands. These are the kind of geography of where the settlements are being built. And I think this is the most important and distressing diagram. which relates to the number of Palestinians attacked, killed, and injured by Israelis. Mayor Blumkin, an Israeli human rights activist, posted on Facebook during one such incident in June of this year: Palestine is on fire. Settler outposts growing in number and size in the West Bank on a daily basis. Settlers storming into villages, setting fires to homes and cars, firing live ammunition. This is how you pave the way to forced expulsion: permits, bulldozers, arson, guns. And again, I want to be as clear as possible about this. The reason Hamas is able to radicalize Palestinian youth is all of this is recorded on social media. These are young men, primarily men, who have no opportunity for economic advancement, 50% unemployment in their society, who feel completely deprived of dignity. There's no opportunity for them to marry in their social structure, to express themselves, to have some kind of accomplishment, some kind of recognition. And they're seeing people who look just like them, who may be in fact related to them, being routinely brutalized and dispossessed. And they then see participating in violence as the only path available to them to gather some recognition. This is part of the context. And so then we return to the remaining context. I want to talk about Gaza, and I want to be as clear as possible. Hamas is, I think, undoubtedly a corrupt, Islamicist, terrorist, theocratic regime, more interested in inciting hatred and violence than alleviating misery. It has, right, won an election in 2005 where it got a majority of seats. But please note, the Palestinian Authority got a minority of seats. The result was basically an internal Palestinian civil war from 2005 to 2007. Hamas brutally expelled the Palestinian Authority. There has been no election since. As I've said, it's only a minority of Palestinians in Gaza who support Hamas. Most of them are terrified of what the consequence of this most recent aggression and terrorism will be. And please note that Hamas's chief aim is radicalizing. And I want to be as clear as possible. Israel, I think, has thought and hoped that Hamas was moderating over the last decade as it became the government of Gaza, that it was forced to become more pragmatic. And the brutal lesson of the last week is that has not occurred. So Israel's policy over the last decade has been one of, in essence, trying to ameliorate some of the misery in Gaza and trying to, in a sense, play Hamas off the Palestinian Authority so that the Palestinians are internally divided. The effort of the previous decade to actually make peace with the Palestinians has given way to a policy of simply trying to contain and internally weaken the Palestinians. And the result has been Israeli tolerance and maybe even quiet support for Hamas as a way of internally dividing and weakening the Palestinians. I think it's absolutely clear Israel will abandon that policy and now try to destroy Hamas. The attacks And I'm going to quote Israeli newspaper, liberal newspaper, Haratz's editorial, are a consequence of a foreign policy that was keyed to annexation and dispossession, that ignored the existence and rights of Palestinians. And so again, I'm not looking to excuse or to justify or to assign blame, but I am suggesting that we need to pay attention to the broader context. What conditions make people ripe for radicalization? It turns out it's been very hard to radicalize people in America. The chief form of radicalization is white Christian nationalism these days. And even that tends, for the most part, not to be terribly violent. We've got to ask how those conditions come to be and what we can do to end those conditions. And that requires acknowledging the humanity and rights of Palestinians. I think it ultimately requires ending the illegal occupation and especially the ongoing settler dispossession of Palestinians and creating instead the conditions of opportunity for those who are currently immiserated so that they see some way of leading a dignified life that is not a life that is committed to violence against the enemy. This is, by the way, a summary of a position articulated by Palestinian human rights activist Mustafa Barghouti. Um, I want to pay attention for a moment to the broader historical context, and I'm going to argue that this is one of declining global order and dysfunction in the democratic world, including internal dysfunction in Israel and the United States. Remember that Hezbollah and the Palestinian Authority are players in this theater as well. That one scenario that Israel is desperately trying to avoid, but if they do in fact launch a ground attack, may be difficult or impossible to avoid, is Hezbollah becoming involved in this conflict, in which case this conflict escalates. It potentially leads to a two-front war for Israel in both Lebanon and Gaza, and Hezbollah is much more sophisticated in terms of the kind of armaments and infrastructure it possesses. This could be an overall terrible escalating war crisis that results from the invasion of Gaza, if that's in fact what is coming. Uh, and of course, the Palestinian Authority, which has been, I think, gaining in stature, not that it's doing so wonderfully either, but at least it seems to be a little better at providing school, jobs, uh, ability to get into Israel, medicine, food for its citizens. This is clearly, on the other hand, a problem that the Palestinian Authority has been unable under the current Israeli government to prevent settlers from pushing Palestinians off of the land they own, they cultivate, they rely on, and that is, for in many cases, their ancestral homeland. The global order has been weakened. I think that's obvious from the Ukrainian war, the Russian attack on the Ukraine, by a West that is weaker and more divided, especially the US, which is, as I've said in the past, both the architect and anchor of the global order, and that the global order is perceived outside of the West primarily as biased toward the West, but nevertheless has been successful mainly in securing an era of relative peace over the last 30 years. But the internal weakening of the West is resulting in a reemergence of a multipolar world in which Iran and the Saudis feel increasing license to do what they want, please note that part of the proximate background to this is, of course, that the Biden administration was trying to broker diplomatic relations between Israel and Saudi Arabia, and that the Iranians felt that they would be further isolated against their rival Saudi Arabia if that occurred. And so Iran greenlit, I think it's quite clear, the Hamas attack on Israel. And I'll just speculate here. I don't know, but there's growing alliance between Iran and Russia in the aftermath of Russia's invasion of the Ukraine. They are two pariah states now in the post war global order constructed by the US, and so they see themselves as natural allies. I want to say a couple more things. I've got plenty to talk about today. The first is that if Israel invades, and I'll just point very quickly, I think Nicholas Kristof has a very good editorial in the New York Times today. Um, and it's good because it asks the right questions. Where does the hate come from? And he says, look, it comes from Hamas, but it also comes from the suffering and humiliation of many Palestinians at the hands of Israel in both the Gaza, which has been under a strangling siege for a decade now, an embargo from both Egypt and Israel, as well as in the West Bank. And then the most important question is, what will Israel accomplish if it actually invades Gaza? It will almost certainly kill many more civilians, reduce Gaza to rubble. How will it rule? And so this then leads me back to the question of, if we become convinced that we want to break the cycle rather than just repeating and escalating another cycle of crime, revenge, vengeance, crime, revenge, vengeance. How do we do it? And one thing to notice is that in these conflicts, both sides fail to recognize the humanity of the other. We've seen the rhetoric on the part of both Hamas and Israel in this regards, and this justifies what I'm calling barbarizing violence, violence against the other, disregards their humanity, and leads them to want the same against you. It extinguishes the moral regard for the other side on both sides. Is there any way out of this? And I just want to point to two possible glimmers of hope. The first is the fact that Israel was so vulnerable to this attack, which of course is a terrible thing. And yet, for the last 20 plus years, Israel has absolutely relied on asymmetrical dominance in terms of both military force and intelligence. It's always one step ahead. It always knows more about what the other side is doing than the other side knows. It always is therefore able to anticipate and thwart planned attacks, or to minimize and mitigate the damage that they do, and to impose a kind of suffering on the other side that ultimately serves as a deterrent. And I think, in light of what happened last weekend, many Israelis are asking, is that still true today? And if it's not still true, then do we try to reconstruct asymmetrical dominance? And then that probably means, among other things, invading and leveling large areas of the Gaza Strip? Or instead, do they try to seek a long-term solution that says we're never going to be secure? This idea of invulnerability based on military might has already been exposed as not sustain sustainable over the long term. Maybe we need to pursue another strategy. At the same time, I think one of the questions is, does the brutal criminal attack on Israeli civilians, killing children, abducting infants, and inviting lethal retaliation ultimately delegitimize Hamas in the eyes of many Palestinians? This could shift the terrain on both sides. And I do think that intelligent, far-sighted leadership in Israel and Palestine, in the United States, in other countries that are interested in resolving this, should try to de-escalate this conflict and broker mutual recognition. I have images on the board of Bill Clinton's long, difficult diplomatic effort to broker peace between two Israeli leaders, first at Camp David, then in Oslo, and the ultimate handshake and accord. Of course, it did not work out in the way that was hoped, but part of what I think is important to see is you have a president who is the leader of the most powerful country in the world, focused on two leaders who are more moderate than the leaders of Israel or Palestine are today. We lack all three. And so this is going to further complicate life. I've already quoted you, Nicholas Kristof. I also wanted to quote you, David Shulman, who's an Israeli human rights activist. Just, I want, in a sense, as balanced a perspective as possible. Many of us are very much focused on the criminal atrocities committed by Hamas last weekend and the horror they inspire. But I think we need to see in the background also what the settlers are doing. And I want to be as clear as possible. This is a very small and very extreme minority of the Israeli population, but the government is providing them with the security to implement their policy. And so despite the fact that the majority of Israelis are not in favor of what they're doing, they're able to continue to dispossess Palestinians with impunity. Here's how Schulman describes it. A hidden universe of suffering touches nearly every Palestinian home. He's quoting a book written about a particular incident. There's no way to justify any of it unless one thinks that ensuring eternal Jewish supremacy over all of Palestine, and with it an Israeli version of apartheid, is a worthy objective. The moral foundation of the state of Israel has been severely compromised, perhaps beyond repair, and exchanged for the horrific reality of the occupation, which is further entrenched with each passing hour. It is obvious, though many refuse to see it, that the only way Israel can survive in the long run is to come to terms with the Palestinian national movement. That is to make peace, an honest and generous peace. And please note that that was written in late September, a mere 2.5 weeks ago, and yet it may already seem an eternity ago based on the events on the ground. All right, you've let me talk about a difficult topic in an uninterrupted way for a very long time. Let me stop and hear your thoughts and comments. Who wants to start us out? John, go ahead. You're muted, John. Still muted.
Okay, I'm sorry. I wanted to add an historical note, but also a contemporary one. I just read an article by Ian Lustig, professor emeritus at Penn University. He's a sympathizer with the Arab side of these things, but he's a very distinguished scholar. And he points out that Hamas was actually created with great support from Israel. At the time, its sponsor was the Muslim Brotherhood, but Israel supported them because Israel was very much against Arafat and the Palestine Liberation Organization. This is a well-known fact, but recently, I'm going to read half a paragraph here. In public comments made before the October attack by both Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu and Bezalel Smotrich, who is the Minister of Finance, he's the main spokesman for the settlers, uh, that the Nationalist Palestine Authority, the more or less governing body of Palestinians in that area, with its ambition to build a Palestinian nation state alongside Israel, should be seen as the real enemy compared to Hamas, whose threat to the Palestine Authority's political position makes it, in their eyes, a valued asset. That Hamas is an asset for Israel. This was said about 3 weeks ago. This is not an old historical statement, and it's really something.
And I want to give a little bit more context to that, John. Smotrich, who's quoted there, is the public advocate for the second Nakba, right? So it's for the second expulsion of Palestinians from Palestine, right? And Nakba, and so.
Well, his position is, but that's Netanyahu. They both said it basically.
Yeah. But so the policy here, and so going back to the 1980s, Hamas is seen as the moderate wing of the Muslim Brotherhood. It actually starts out doing humanitarian work, and yet in the 1990s, it's primarily taken over by Iranians and radicalized, and so there's a long history here. But I think that in a sense, the fundamental strategic ploy, Israel can manipulate Palestinian politics by playing one side off of the other, and in so doing internally divide and weaken, and therefore dampen the appeal of Palestinian nationalism overall. This is, I think, I don't know. I'm not the kind of realist that tends to be attracted to this kind of politics. So I recognize that I'm skeptical to begin with, but it seems to me this is increasingly exposed as a losing game, right? You strengthen one side of your enemy in the hope that they're going to fight the other side of your enemy, but you're also strengthening them to fight you, right? And if you continue at the same time to do things that many Palestinians see as an assault on their dignity and their right to form a nation and to have some control over their future, the likelihood that they're going to ultimately strike back at the Israelis is, it seems to me, very strong. Yeah, thank you for sharing that, John. It is very helpful and good context as well. Anybody else? It's a grim topic, I know, and I'm wondering whether you want me to go back to talking about artificial intelligence. We could put our heads in the sand and wish that it didn't happen. But I do think we need to talk about it. We need to talk about it honestly, and that includes looking at the terrible violence being unleashed on both sides. Wilma, go ahead.
I want to thank you for your perspective. I think it's exactly what's needed now. We have to stop dehumanizing each other. We have to stop pursuing activities that dehumanize everybody, including ourselves. And it's like, take a step back, take a deep breath. But who are we, and what kind of world do we want to live in? And how do you go about trying to make that world happen? And that's why I think I really appreciate what you're saying, because I believe it's the only way forward that makes any sense at all.
I have Israeli friends and colleagues, many of whom I think would have a lot of sympathy and respect for what I've said today. Every now and then, I come across an Israeli who says to me, well, you don't live there, you don't understand. And then something akin to they're animals. They don't understand anything except for violence. And the they there might be the Palestinians, might be the Arabs, might be the Muslims. And yes, it's precisely that dehumanizing of the other that leads you into this cycle that once you're in it is so hard to break. And of course, if you're talking to Palestinians, and I had the great good fortune of bringing one of the leading Palestinian human rights lawyers to campus a while ago, uh the humane, the let me not bias it. There are many Palestinians who would say, in the same way that Israelis would be sympathetic with what I'm saying, they would too would be sympathetic with what I'm saying. But there are obviously also many Palestinians who engage in the mirror image dehumanization of the other. And of course, when one side brutalizes, barbarizes the other side, it makes it all the more credible for the other side to say, see, I told you that they're barbarians, we can't act with them. They're animals, we shouldn't sympathize with them. Gloria, go ahead.
I think the issue of the existence of the state of Israel itself is the main issue here. Because if we can get the Arab countries to accept the existence of the state of Israel and the support of such existence, then those radicals that do come into the territory of Israel and kill people, and they have done it all along. They have done it on buses. They have done it on kibbutzim. They have done it from the Golan Heights when they had the Golan Heights. So we're not, that's nothing new. The issue is the existence of the state of Israel. And I really don't know what is the solution for that. Palestine is not a state. It was a territory that was a mandate of the British, and before that, a mandate of the Turks. So it's not a state by itself. It was occupied. And the British happened to be willing to give a certain territory to the Jews. So that's, we're dealing on the larger political scale. That's the main issue, I think.
And so, Gloria, I'm going to say a couple things. One of them, I think it's interesting to note and give credit where credit is due. The Trump administration's Abraham Accords have increased the recognition of Israel on the part of Arab states in its immediate environment. The Biden administration is in the middle of, and it may be scuttled now, trying to negotiate Saudi recognition of Israel. If that occurs, then we can increasingly say what the problem is. And I think in a sense, it's quite obvious. The chief architect of anti-Israeli, anti-Zionist policy in the region right now is Iran, right? It's not only Iran, but it is Iran that is funding and encouraging and radicalizing. And so I want to agree with you, but also note that it may be narrower. It's not the entire region in the way that it was 50 years ago. Now, you also bring us back to 1948 and the founding of Israel. And I'll just remind you of the Zionist as well as the British rhetoric at this time. And I think it's worthwhile noting Zionism was internally diverse in the first half of the 20th century. There were Zionists calling for the creation not of a Jewish state, but of a multi-denominational or multicultural state in Palestine that included both Jews and Palestinians. But the rhetoric that carried the day was, quote, a state without a people for a people without a state. And the problem is, of course, that Palestine was neither a state nor a place without a people, right? There were millions of Palestinians living in what the British called the Palestine Protectorate, and to fail to acknowledge their right to remain in their ancestral homeland at the same time that the Jews who had just suffered the Holocaust in Europe relocated to that territory. This was a foundational mistake, as far as I'm concerned, at the beginning of Israeli society. And in a sense, if we go all the way back to the origin of the cycle, maybe that's the origin, although I don't think going back and searching for blame is the right way to go. So I guess I want to say I view the history as a little bit more complicated and ambiguous than what you're suggesting, Gloria.
Well, I have not known a situation where Arabs and Jews lived in a state in peace over the whole history, more than a few years, and could be 100 years, but it always fizzled out, whether it was Spain or any other state.
That's absolutely incorrect. There are lots of times.
So I don't think you can have both, a state of both. Sooner or later it won't work.
And I'm going to be really direct with you, Gloria, and I hope I won't offend you. There are people who say the same thing about blacks and whites in the South in the Jim Crow era. They say the reason we have to have segregation is because it never works for them to coexist with us. There are South Africans who said this about apartheid for 80, 90 years. And at some point, I think we've got to just ask, is there something essential about Jews and Arabs that makes them like oil and water, that they can't actually recognize the humanity of each other? Or at bottom, are they human beings? And they have a difficult, in many respects, terrible history. But having said that, history is not destiny. And at some level, we need to be able to break free of history if we're not going to keep killing each other, if we're not going to be victimized by each other. Gloria, I think you and I would need to sit down for a long time to discuss this, but I hope you will take this in the spirit of an invitation to rethink some of what you're thinking, not hoping that I'm going to convince you right away, but I do think there's that question. What is it about Arabs and Jews that means that they cannot ever get along? And I will tell you,
I don't know. I can tell you, I do not know.
Okay. Wilma, go ahead.
When given the opportunity, people are people. They want to have their families. They want to raise them to be healthy and happy and have a future. And when people take that perspective, they find a way to get along. And that's been true even in Israel right now. There are Jews and Arabs who are working together and who are accomplishing wonderful things. There's been so much pressure on Palestinians not to work with Jews, not to try to work at anything out. And the same thing of Jews not to work with Arabs. But when people just approach each other as people and understand we just want to live in peace and have our families prosper, it happens. It's just that simple.
And I want to be just illustrate this for a second. Thank you for that, Wilma. And so I quoted both a Palestinian and an Israeli who work for the same human rights organization to give us some perspective on what's happening with the settler occupation movement. When I mentioned, I brought one of the leading Palestinian human rights lawyers to speak at Sarah Lawrence, and we did that with the New School because we didn't have the budget to do it ourselves. But the person who really extended the invitation and made it happen is an Israeli political scientist, a Jewish man who works very closely with this Palestinian man. And it's funny, he's one of the leading political scientists. He was going back to law school because he wanted to retire to be a human rights lawyer. And he was inspired by this Palestinian human rights lawyer. And so the Palestinian human rights lawyer was an Arab Israeli citizen, right? And so yes, I think it's absolutely right that whether we're talking about the golden age of Spain, in which there was this tremendous cross-pollination of Jewish and Muslim culture for a couple hundred years, and really I think it's the Catholics more than anyone who messed that up. But having said all of that, right, that it just seems like there isn't anything in the DNA of Jews and Arabs that prevents them from working together. We see this in the world today. And on the other hand, that doesn't mean that all we got to do is to hold hands and come together. This is an enormously complicated, difficult situation. And I recognize, as an American of Jewish descent, my perspective is very different than if I was living in Israel. And it was, my son whose life was in danger from these incursions. I think that that's absolutely correct. In the same way that it's very easy for me to encourage the Palestinians to discredit Hamas when they're living in such complete misery, right? And so I don't want to minimize the difficulty, the depth, the mistrust, the hostility, the desire for vengeance from a long history of historical grievance. I just also do want to push back against the idea that it's impossible. All right, everybody, wonderful being with you again. Thank you for your patience as we've talked about a really difficult topic. Not what I plan to talk with you about today, according to the outline for the topics for this month. But having said that, given what happened in the news, I think it was essential that we have this conversation. Take care. Thanks for your goodwill today, and be well. I'll see everybody next week. Thank you, Jen.
Thank you, David.
Bye, guys.
Thank you so much, David.
My pleasure as always. Thanks, everybody. Be well. See you next week.